This presentation was originally designed to speak about the process of transcending boundaries. That was the life and praxis of Aleister Crowley for a alternative sexuality conference. A lot of you will be familiar with the information I'm about to impart, or at least most of it, but I want you to think about the benefits the alternative sexuality community have reaped from his life. I personally am a sadist, a masochist, a lover of men and women, polyamorous by nature, thrilled by the games of power that humans play intimately, and I absolutely abhor labels in their mainstream usage. Labels should be there for our convenience, to communicate our desires and passions, to bond in camaraderie, not so that society knows which box to shut us away in from their comfortable worlds while they pretend that they don't like some of the things that we do. Fear is a strong motivator. They fear what they have in common with us will say about them. I am also a worker, a magician, a priestess, an initiator, and more recently, an elector for U.S. Grand Lodge. We are a magical, mystical, and social organization previously headed by Aleister Crowley and redesigned by him to spread his message, "Do what thou wilt, shall he behold the law." I quote to you from our mission statement. Our mission is to affect and promote the doctrines and practices of the philosophical and religious system known as Thelema, with particular emphasis on cultivating the ideals of individual liberty, self-discipline, self-knowledge, and universal brotherhood. Sexual liberty is one of our great tenets, and I consider Crowley an ancestor to the sexual liberation movement, though that was only one part of his life's work, true liberation being his goal. So I'll give you a little background on Crowley, briefly mentioning his methods, review a scandal or two caused by his way of going, and then come back to that question which really brings us all here. Should we not be able to conclude our own path, to act in accord with the dictates of our soul? I found a perfect introduction to Crowley as a quote from Henry Hall of the New York World Sunday magazine, dated December 1914, in his bio Perdurabo by Brother Richard Kaczynski. Aleister Crowley is the strangest man I ever met. He is a man with whom men quarrel. Intensely magnetic, he attracts people or repels them with equal violence. His personality seems to breed rumors everywhere they follow him. One man to whom I spoke lauded Crowley as a poet of rare delicacy, the author of Hail Mary, a garland of verses in honor of the Mother of God. Another alluded to him as an unsparing critic of American literature. Another knew him as the holder of some world records for mountain climbing. Still another warned me against him as a thoroughly bad man, a Satanist or devil worshipper, steeped in black magic, the high priest of Beelzebub. An actor knew him only as a theatrical producer and as the designer of extraordinary stage costumes. A publisher told me that Crowley was an essayist and philosopher whose books, nearly all privately issued, were masterpieces of modern printing. By others, he was variously pictured to me as a big game hunter, as a gambler, as an editor, as an explorer. Some said that he was a man of real attainments, others that he was a faker. All agreed that he was extraordinary. This is overall not a bad account of the man, though they forgot a few things like theologian, world teacher. I would clearly illustrate for you everything that this irrepressible genius was, had we all day, in a case of one. Instead, I must be brief. So let us to our work. At the intersection of religion and sexuality, freedom and Victorian sensibilities, you find the wickedest man on earth, Aleister Crowley, forerunner to the age of the individual, our new aeon, in which we can, through the power of our own wills, decide who we are to be, not limited to, our genders, our preferences, and our proclivities. Growing up, Crowley was intense. His early life was full of restriction. Most of his family was off limits because they were members of less exclusive sects of the Plymouth Brethren, or even belonged to other Christian groups. He was only allowed to read the Bible until the 9th year, and later in his childhood he had to sneak into the bathroom to read school assignments that were deemed inappropriate by his strict guardian. His mother was the first to name him the Great Beast, referencing the revelation of St. John, when he would get out of line like any normal boy in his youth. This was a name he would later embrace as breaking the ties of the repressive, duplicitous society with which he would always clash. Spending many years in boarding schools, he was metaphorically warned away from the dangers of homosexuality, but was so naive in his sheltering, it took him a year or so to determine what it was they'd actually warned him off of. And later, in true hypocritical fashion, was propositioned by a Plymouth Brethren man who was hired as his tutor when he was too sick to return to the abusive boys' school system after being tortured for a year with malnutrition and seclusion when he would not admit to some crime of which they did not even have the decency to accuse him. In his teen years, he was seduced by a chambermaid and took him upon his mother's bed. She soon attempted to extort a better station in life from his uncle by claiming her virtue had been stolen by Crowley, and was summarily dismissed from service and thrown out into the world to make her own way without a penny to her name by his pious Christian family. Observing these pitiless, tyrannical, and restrictive behaviors, and being well versed in the Bible and the message of Jesus Christ, he decided that this Christianity of hypocrisy and cruelty was not true Christianity, thereby outgrowing his family and community with that one thought. Analyzing the situation, he realized that sin was the problem. He would live in fear of it no more, never again stand accused in its name, or live gloomily through its evasion. He decided he would be a sinner. Not your garden variety sinner, but a true connoisseur, embracing it at every opportunity to overcome societally imposed mores or baggage. He had no idea how true that would become in the eyes of the world. He conquered his failing health through his pursuit and mastery of mountain climbing, setting records that stood almost 80 years later, blazing the trail on some of the highest mountains in the world, outlining the paths that would eventually be taken to reach their summits, though his own attempts were thwarted by weather or mutiny. He was denied membership in the prestigious Alpine Mountain Club and the Royal Geographical Society, however, exactly because he was a trailblazer, pioneering new methods that would not be put into common use until our modern era. This would often be his problem. Being the first is not often socially acceptable. Upon adulthood, he escaped to Trinity College at Cambridge, where he pursued the chemical arts, but fell in love equally with poetry and, while hunting new sins, Herbert Charles Jerome Pollitt, fellow student, patron of the arts and the decadent movement, and the much-lauded female impersonator, Diane de Ruffey, Crowley's closest friend at school and the sealer of his bisexuality. He who seduced me first I could not forget. I hardly loved him, but desire to taste a new strong sin. My sorrow does not fret that sore, but thou with sudden arms embraced my shrinking body, and who brought a blush into my cheeks and turned my veins to fire. Thou who didst whelm me with the eager rush of the enormous floods of thy desire. Thine are the kisses that devour me yet. Thine the high heaven whose loss is death to me. Thine all the barbed arrows of regret. Thine in whose arms I yearn to be. In my deep heart thy name is writ alone. Men shall decipher when they split the stone. They were inseparable, enjoying, to quote Crowley, that intimacy which the Greeks considered the greatest glory of manhood. In his copy of a novel of the time, whose main character was based on Pollitt, Crowley scrawled, "I lived with Pollitt as his wife for some 6 months, and he made a poet out of me." His first book had come out during this time with the dedication to this, his lover and lord. Sadly, they grew apart as Crowley continued to climb mountains without the less physically active Pollitt, and thereby met those who introduced him to the magical systems of Victorian England, leading to his return to the quest to fill the void left by the failure of his life in Christianity, causing him to give his life over to religion. Though he left him behind to pursue his new religious life, he always missed Jerome. But there was still self-recrimination and personal discomfort with his bisexuality, leftover baggage from his fundamentalist upbringing, and it ended poorly. A subsequent book, focusing on the joys of homosexuality, The Scented Garden of Abdullah the Satirist of Shiraz, featured a poem, The Riddle, which began, Habib hath heard, let all Iran, who spell aright from A to Z, exalt thy fame and understand, with whom I made a marriage bed. Which answered its own riddle by spelling out the name of Herbert Pollitt in acrostic style, for which Crowley became infamous. Another poem, the Amphora, spelled out the phrase in acrostic, "The Virgin Mary I desire, but arseholes set my prick on fire." Amazingly, he became known as one of the best poets, English poets at metric verse while having this fun. He left school pursuing his passions full-time: poetry, climbing, religion, and love. He loved many and often and with full heart, often simultaneously. I cannot possibly go into all of his loves, but I shall mention a few key ones. Rose Kelly, his first wife, who he married almost on a lark, seeking to emancipate her from an untenable situation. She was a widow and engaged to 2 men, being pressured by her family to choose one to marry, when he offered her a third alternative: marry him and be free of the dictates of others. She made the obvious choice, and through their union she would help lead him to the reception of our sacred law, the Book of the Law, wherein we are given the message, "Do what thou wilt." This, on which our entire philosophy is built, which requires the pursuit of our wills, our function and design, and the accomplishment of this to the exclusion of all else that may tempt us, though it would take him years to fully grasp this himself. Still, in the same year he published The Sword of Song, where he first called himself the Great Beast, and where he was already starting to own that force and fire that is the Thelemic current, as we can see in his letter to his brother-in-law and old chum, Gerald Kelly, here excerpted. This book has been boycotted by English publishers and printers. I am in arms against a world, but after 5 years of folly and weakness, miscalled politeness, tact, discretion, care for the feeding of others, I am weary of it. Did Christ mince his words with the Pharisees? I say today, to hell with Christianity, rationalism, Buddhism, all the lumber of the centuries. I bring you a positive and primeval fact, magic by name. And with this I will build me a new heaven and a new earth. I want none of your faint approval or faint dispraise. I want blasphemy, murder, rape, and revolution, anything bad or good but strong. I want men behind me, or before me if they can surpass me, but men, not gentlemen. Bring me your personal vigor, all of it, not your spare vigor. Bring me all the money you have or you can force from others. If I can get but 7 such men, the world is at my feet. If 10, heaven will fall at the sound of one trumpet to arms. Sadly, after the death of their child, Rose's drinking got out of hand, and refusing to help herself or to accept the help of family and friends after numerous interventions, Crowley left her, moving on with his life. Though he had had mistresses and lovers even during their marriage, eventually providing her with the evidence necessary to divorce him, lest she lose societal status through being divorced in a time when women still had no rights. He had been in a magical dry spell before marrying Rose, and she had brought him back to magic in addition to the reception of our holy book in the beginning of our new age, the Aeon of the Child, wherein we have become concerned with individuals' progress and betterment, hence dedicated to the liberty of the individual through self-discipline. Returning to magic, he began teaching others this practice, publishing numerous treatises, practices, and until then, secret rituals of initiation for the edification of humankind. His own progress and initiatory ordeals continued, taking many more loves and joys from him as he sacrificed everything that he had or would have upon the altar of religious attainment. He developed a system of magical attainment through experiment and the scientific method, the byline of his opus Equinox being the method of science, the aim of religion. Another love, the poet Victor Newberg, was one of his great magical partners, and they accomplished much together. Alone, they walked through Algeria and the Sahara for weeks, touring the land, performing magic, and achieving new initiatory states. Never one to care for what others thought, Crowley paraded through the desert with Newberg on a leash, head shaved except for 2 locks twisted into little horns, his imp or djinn. This was not their only foray into power exchange, however. While scrying the aethers and marching on, Crowley was inspired to consecrate a mountain rock face as a temple to Pan. Crowley realized that a sacrifice was necessary, and having not thought to bring a basket of live chickens with him, they went with the next best thing, the spilling of seed for the life force offering, sex magic. Here, Victor became the active and Crowley the passive, and afterward, basking in the transcendent glow, Crowley realized the power of sex in ritual and transcended the ego through the indulgence and acceptance of his homosexual side, embracing that which was taboo in his time. Later, in his own collection of poems, Newberg was to remember this time with Crowley. Sweet wizard, in whose footsteps I have trod unto the shrine of the most obscene god, let me once more feel thy strong hand to be, making the magic signs upon me. Stand, stand in the light, and let mine eyes drink in the glorious vision of the death of sin. The last loves I will mention were at his Abbey of Thelema at Cefalù, in Sicily, where he and some of his followers had gone after the trials and tribulations of World War I, to practice their spirituality in peace, and to test their limits, and to seek the universal truths. What is the meaning of initiation? It is the path to the realization of yourself as the soul, the supreme, the absolute of all truth, beauty, purity, perfection. From Magic Without Tears. Cefalù was for all intents and purposes a monastery, but not one as the average person would imagine. But yes, it was a place of residence occupied by a community of persons living in seclusion under religious vows, where they lived by a secluded, dedicated, or self-disciplined manner of living. There were, however, no vows of celibacy. Crowley impregnated 2 women while at Cefalù, one upon his main magical partner, or Scarlet Woman, Leah Hersig, the other upon their governess, Nanette Shumway, each already having small boys with them from previous relationships. Leah, however, was far more comfortable with this sharing than Nanette, who had not fully dedicated herself to the path of Thelema and the polyamorous relationships required by Aleister Crowley. I phrase this such that you do not think it is required of Thelemites to be polyamorous, but if they are in untraditional relationships, it is accepted as the norm. The residents of the Abbey were required to sign a magical oath, the Oath of Affiliates. I, willing to abide within the Abbey of Thelema, make oath and sign that I do utterly deny, abjure, and condemn all allegiance soever to all gods and men, accepting the law of Thelema as my sole law, that I affirm the book of the law to be the word of truth and the rule of life, that I dedicate myself utterly and without stint, my body and soul, to the great work which is to proclaim and execute the law of Thelema, that I will accept unquestionably and irrevocably the conditions of life in the Abbey of Thelema, and uphold its ordinances and customs, and maintain the authority of the Scarlet Woman, and of her lord, the Beast 666. Here, his students kept strict records of all their activities, meditations, visions, and even petty jealousies, in journals for the master to review. The standard practices of Thelema were followed. 4 times per day, the magicians performed the ritual known as Liber Resh, where we identify ourselves with the sun through its 4 main phases, overcoming the formula of the slain god through this recognition of the permanence of the sun and its mysteries. As our holy book tells us, every man and every woman is a star. Through this realization of self with that fiery furnace that spewed out the building blocks that made us and that continues to nourish us through the processes of life on this planet, we recognize the divinity within ourselves and the oneness of each other. With each meal, a sort of prayer was said, called will, wherein we affirm the purpose of our act of eating and its role in aiding us to accomplish our true wills. Fire does not burn without fuel. There are other rituals we perform to develop a skill, such as Liber Yegorum for the training of the mind, or more regularly as part of our processes. We are instructed to perform the Eucharist daily, whether it be through our central public and private ritual, the Gnostic Mass, our sunset ritual, the Mass of the Phoenix, or to partake of that Eucharist which is the sexual union, which partakes of the secrets of our upper degrees. We make sacred, protected ritual space through our banishing rituals of the pentagram and hexagram, and we use the invoking version to put ourselves in balance with the universe, correcting any imbalance we may personally have. Establish thyself firmly in the equilibrium of forces, in the center of the cross of the elements, that cross from whose center the creative word issued in the birth of the dawning universe. The Master Therion suggested what some would consider unusual practices in the name of the great work, but always designed to make the student more efficient in their ways. When his third love, actress Jane Wolfe, got off track on her spiritual path with her unceasing focus on material gripes and discomforts, the Master Therion banished her for nearly a fortnight of silent meditation and prayer upon the beach of their abbey, where she could bring no entertainments, his having a tent struck for her, and food brought to her once daily in the form of grapes and bread and water. Here she passed through her hatred of Crowley, to her discomfort in her own head, to the transcendence of ego and the fuller understanding of her place in the universe, thus returning to the abbey a serious and dedicated student. Unfortunately, it did not go as well when he suggested that she spend 2 weeks in a brothel to work through her own attitudes towards sex. Not being a lifer, they would not have her. Here at Cefalu, they experimented with their physical boundaries as well as the mental and aesthetic. Large quantities of drugs were consumed to learn their physical limits and to take them outside of themselves in an attempt to unite with the divine. Asanas, or meditative postures, were pursued for longer and longer periods, learning to dismiss the discomforts of the physical body and to still the stray thoughts of an anxious mind. They ran till they could no more, fasted till they must eat, stayed awake until they had to sleep, taking measure of these limits. For how can you know yourself without knowing your most mundane limits? Others would follow Jane's example to the beach and the privations of the body for the development of the spirit. Those things that were most distasteful or taboo were indulged in, reveled in, and fully identified with, to overcome the bonds of a restrictive and judgmental society and the emotional and mental baggage it heaps on everyone. Here at Cefalu, Crowley and Leah's sexual experiments reached new heights, or depths, if you will. In true Agora style, the effete and opulent Crowley sought to overcome his issues with that which can only be called filth. As the Hindus will embrace the transgressive with meat and wine and sexual orgies, being normally completely outside of what is acceptable to them, Crowley and Leah embraced that which repulsed them, leading to encounters with and poetry about her bodily waste products, experiments with sadomasochism, and, as inspired by readings of Greek and Egyptian rituals of old, they even failed in an attempt to get a goat upon her. Crowley stood in, and the ritual was completed. While he is well known to have experimented with drugs, Crowley was actually against anything that came close to abuse or habit, inviting students out to Cefalu to give them the opportunity to clean up and also to study magic in a supportive and conducive environment, as well as publishing his potboiler, Diary of a Drug Fiend, which studied the deprivation caused by cocaine abuse. And in my experienced opinion, it is a great read for anyone trying to get off drugs, offering methods based on Thelemic principles to the protagonists. True to form, this was poorly received by the press, one of whom called for the immediate suppression, if not outright burning, of this book. This prompted the press to review the controversial aspects of his past, the suggestive titles of his books, such as The Honorable Adulterers, the erotic white stains in the scented garden, summing up his literature as blasphemous and disgusting, and his language that of a pervert, going on to describe the depraved orgies and his sending of his women into the streets of Palermo to prostitute themselves to support financially his love cult. He took this and many a libel before and after with a grain of salt, or if time he allowed, used it to promote his latest books. The press, however, became more and more heated, especially with the exaggerated tale of disgruntled ex-students. And the day came when Mussolini's Italy would have no more of it, and he was given a week to leave, despite a petition circulated by the neighbors who adored him. This was by no means the end of Aleister Crowley. He spent the next 20-plus years of his life training students, writing and publishing some of his best works, loving men and women, being a man or woman, spreading Thelema wherever he went, and having a war or wit with this poet or that society in true Crowley fashion. I stop with Cefalù because those years were his most fruitful in his exploration of sexuality, though by no means the end of it. It was here he wrote his treatise on sexual freedom. You are, of course, intimately familiar with it, but let me excerpt from it. He who censures and constrains the sexual character of another not only makes himself the measure of the universe, but sets himself up against inexorable necessity, denying the order of existence and resisting the rights of reality, but condemns also himself, for he is one of the causes of the cosmos, and constricts himself, for to change the course of another would cause a counterpoise falling on him. All souls exist eternally, identical in essence, individual in expression. Each is equally ineffable, impenetrable, inaccessible. The nature of each is necessary. Therefore all destiny is also designed, and its way no more than the name of will. None can be aught but what it is. Did it will to be anything else, that will would be the norm of its nature. Each soul is the absolute and independent, not less but more for its inherent identity with itself, is implicitly involved in its consubstantial coexistence with an infinity of coordinate companions. I can talk about him all day, as I said before, but I'd like to point out again two of our base techniques. I mentioned Resh, our sun salutation, and its purpose of identifying ourselves with our immediate galactic creator. But it is also an instiller of self-discipline. Through the devotion and repetition, we strengthen our will and resolve. Through will, our prayer before meals, we devote and consecrate our meal to the great work, which is the perfection of self and the uplifting of humanity. In Thelema, we are taught to make no difference between any one thing and any other thing, for thereby cometh hurt. We are all one, gay, straight, bi, pan, fluid, poly, mono, kinky, asexual, and vanilla. The illusion of separateness, the evil of dualism, the either-or, us-them mentality holds us all back. Yes, we must perfect the individual self. We are each, however, how the divine spark has chosen to manifest and experience the material realm. We are obligated to make the most of that. But we are not separate from each other. We are all from that divine spark. We are a web of complex ecosystems, to quote Lee Harrington from his keynote at Transcending Boundaries. And I say that that web is the universe made manifest. We will transcend together or no. We can be held back by our own fears or those of others in our world, or we can remember these words. Fear is failure and the forerunner of failure, and courage is the beginning of virtue. Have the courage to live by your convictions no matter the price, as Crowley did, as I do, as Lee Harrington does in the alt-sex community, as several others of you here today do. Look to these examples. We can only be kept down if we allow it to be so. A man is what he maketh himself within the limits fixed by his inherited destiny. He is a part of mankind. His actions affect not only what he calleth himself, but also the whole universe. Also, remember that unbalanced force is evil, that unbalanced severity is but cruelty and oppression, but that also unbalanced mercy is but weakness which would allow and abet evil. Act passionately, think rationally, be thyself. Aleister Crowley was reviled and loathed and condemned, and he persevered like a magician does. His example spoke to hundreds of others, which in turn spoke to thousands more. Right now in our organization there are over 3,000 strong and diverse souls working to make this world a better place for all of us, by perfecting ourselves, by being shining examples, by reaching out to those in need, by being there when a seeker comes a-knockin'. by sharing and spreading his wisdom and our own. So I return to our original question. Should we not be able to conclude our own path, to act in accord with the dictates of our own souls? In Liber Oz, the Law of Thelema is broken down for us in the simplest of terms, and I find 3 lines of especial interest in the answering of this question. Man has the right to live by his own law. Man has the right to think as he will. Man has the right to love as he will. Take your fill and will of love as ye will, when, where, and with whom ye will. So I answer, yes. Yes, 1,000 times yes, an emphatic, dramatic, ecstatic yes. As the world teacher saith, find each of you your own true way in the universe and follow it with eager joy. There is no law beyond do what thou wilt, do that, and no other shall say nay.